Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Andy Neal. I'm here with my colleague Nick Oldworth to talk about the Protect duty. Welcome to the IRSM's webinar. The discussions are on for about an hour with plenty of time to ask questions. So my job, along with Nick, is just to give you some appraisal and some forewarning of what the Protect duty is likely to bring to us in our operations, if you like. I'm not the actual main font of knowledge on the Protect duty, and Nick is obviously here, who is one of the main founder members of it. So Nick, I wonder if you could just give a brief introduction into your role within the Protect duty.
Thanks, Andy, it's kind. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Oldworth. I'm the former UK Counter-Terrorism National Coordinator. And when I left policing and counter-terrorism a few years ago now, I joined forces with a wonderful lady called Fegan Murray, whose son was murdered at the Manchester Arena bombing. And she felt that not enough was being done to protect people in public spaces and places. I felt that as well, and wasn't able to influence change from inside the organisation. And when I left, I joined forces with her and Brendan Cox, who is the husband of the murdered MP Joe Cox, and we created the Martin's Law campaign, which is the colloquial name for the Protect duty. I wrote the legislative proposal that was given to government, and it was that proposal that the government consulted on last year, reported back to you all earlier this year, and are likely to bring into law by about May next year.
Thanks for that, Nick. And just a little introduction for myself. My name's Andy Neal. I'm the Director of Security at Cardinus Risk Management. I've just, during the lockdown pandemic, I studied a master's degree in terrorism studies, and my dissertation is on behavioural recognition and behavioural detection methods. So I'll be working with Nick today. If we can answer lots of questions or get lots of questions going, it certainly makes it easier for us. We can't actually see you. I can see Nick, and Nick can see me, which is great. But we've got a presentation to go through, and as our colleagues from the IRSM indicated, it will be available for you after this this presentation. So I'm going to start with the first slide, which is the Protect duty, which is the ultimate aim is to create a consistent and proportionate process for enhancing security across any place or space to which the public have access. And it's known as Martin's Law. I'm not sure, Nick, you have done an introduction about Martin's Law, etc. I wonder if you wanted to add some bit more gravitas on the feelings behind the Protect duty and why you went into creating it.
So look, that's Martin. Martin Het was his name. He was, I think, 29 years old when he was murdered. A wonderful, good-looking lad, living his best life. Became quite a character around Manchester, actually. He was a hardcore Coronation Street fan. And after he died, he became known in the media as the boy with the Deirdre tattoos. He had this giant tattoo of Deirdre Barlow on his leg. And basically, he died through shrapnel entering his body in Manchester Arena. Died pretty much instantly. And about a year later, his mum, called Fegan, it's a Turkish name, went to a theatre also in Manchester, and her ticket wasn't even checked, let alone her bag, and she found that genuinely distressing. And that's a narrative, actually, Andy, that I hear from a lot of victims. I work still with quite a lot of victims of terrorism, and they do become quite distressed when they go to places that aren't looked after well. Conversely, they praise places that are. In fact, I only got an email yesterday from somebody who went to a venue in Manchester saying how well it was looked after. So that was our motivation. 22 people were murdered at that event, plus another 14 in London throughout 2017. And there was just a sense that while some parts of looking after people are legislated for, so for example, if you go to a big stadium, your pie must be served at a temperature that's not too hot. You must have an exact number of toilets, or minimum number of toilets for a number of people that are at your venue. But there's absolutely no legal requirement for you to protect people from terrorism. And that's really what Martin's Law became about, which was moving terrorism from being discretionary, or sorry, security from being discretionary to a legislative activity. Terrorists changed their method. Terrorists decided to mobilize everybody, and anybody can be a terrorist now, using anything as a weapon anywhere against any target. And to counter that, society also has to become counter-terrorism citizens, and part of that is those who are responsible for looking after us in places and spaces need to be held to account for that responsibility.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. And I think I'm going to pick up on one point from your introduction there, was about how security is perceived and the quality of security. So I think, most of you, I would suggest, are on this webinar broadcast, maybe within a security role, facilities role, or owner's role. And, if we can give you any advice or any skills on upgrading security, because the security industry is moving fast with different methods of attack and crime, particularly terrorism as well. So I think, from a benefit of attending this, it's about upgrading and having a knowledge of putting skills and procedures into your premises so that we can mitigate risks, which we'll look at as we go through the program. So one of the main areas of the Protect strategy is 5 key requirements. The 5 key requirements, we're going to go through each one, and I'll ask Nick to put any comments on each section. But the first one really is to engage with freely available counter-terrorism advice and training. Now, there are many companies out there specializing in security training, but there is a huge award-winning resource that we can direct you to at the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, who offer a free e-learning, which is very effective and it's award-winning. And that's something or those who are interested in upskilling staff, we would point you in that direction, and upskilling skills towards your personnel. So that's one of the main benefits. And I will keep referring to the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, because that is the main thrust of the information that you will find. If you go online, find any information post this talk, that is where you will find most relevant information. I don't have any information on that, Nick.
Yep, so there's a new resource which is managed by them, and it's called www.protectuk.police.uk. So www.protectuk.police.uk, and that contains all the authoritative information that NACSO have published publicly. It's got various other functions on it that you can engage with, including other webinars. The content is under development. It's not quite, I don't think, in the format that it needs to be to support the general public, but it is all of the information that currently exists. It's just a case of how they present it.
Grant, thanks for that, Nick. And I think if you look at the second point on this screen, is to conduct vulnerability assessments of operating places and spaces. This is quite an interesting area where most of you will be thinking of what assessments are required, and as we go through this program, we'll talk about the requirements of the Protect duty and what the assessments are required. I'm just interested in a little footnote to that is the government stipulates about 650,000 properties or areas will be affected by this Protect duty, and at present only 2% of counter-terrorism advice is actually given to those venues. So it is a huge undertaking for you all to actually work with and to work through. So vulnerability assessments are key to this Protect duty and to protect your assets and people. Nick, I don't need anything on that.
So just for clarity, the 650,000 places are what you might have previously called crowded places, so places where people gather, and the 2% refers to the number of places that get given support by government. So they're usually iconic places with very significant footfall. I think when the law comes in, it won't be quite that many, because almost certainly they're going to create a threshold where some parts of the law apply and some other parts don't. But it will still be a very high number in the hundreds of thousands. And the key to success will be that it's those of you who own or operate places will need to conduct your own vulnerability assessments. And again, information is available for that on Protect UK website. But what you might find is when you've looked at that you're holding risks that are probably too complex or too great for you to decipher and resolve. And that's the point at which you might want to start seeking some expert advice. The idea of the Protect Duty was that it would be low or no cost impact on most people, and I believe that will be the case. But we do recognise that certainly for some of those venues that hold much more complicated risks or vulnerabilities and perhaps have much larger capacities, you may well want to go and get some professional risk management advice.
And which brings us nicely on to the second slide. The third model is to mitigate the risk created by those vulnerabilities. And mitigation of risk is about avoidance and disruption of terrorist attacks and plannings. And I'm going to reiterate what Nick said. I think the government is very keen that there's not too much onus on premises or assets to have an expensive upgrade for the Protect strategy, if you like. So it's about using and thinking about the assessments and your vulnerability assessments and using your current security methods to actually start mitigating risks and look at your current procedures and your processes and see how you can combine it to actually mix and match with your assessment and your vulnerability. So the mitigation of risk is quite a follow-on, and it's closely tied with the assessment. And as Nick said, depending on the levels and complications of your assessment, then conventional security methods may be able to be adapted and shaped towards the Protect duty. The fourth element is, and I'll ask Nick to comment on both 3 and 4. The fourth element is to put in place a counter-terrorism plan. And this is a plan, I would imagine everybody on here, if I went into an office and said to everybody, what is your company's fire evacuation plan? Most people would actually have a very good understanding of the fire evacuation plan because it's drilled and it's learned and it's exercised, etc., etc. Within the Protect duty is what we call in-evacuation, lockdown procedures. If you would ask anybody in a multi-complex building, what's your in-evacuation and lockdown procedures, I expect you'd get puzzled looks. So it's something to consider about what your counter-terrorism plans are about and how you are reacting to any situations going on in and around your asset. Nick.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so the key around mitigation is proportionality in most cases. So we often use the imaginary figure of Mrs. Miggins and her pie shop, to which she may have 50 or 60 people in there at any one time. Are we expecting Mrs. Miggins to put X-ray scanning machines in her doorway? No, of course we're not. Are we expecting her to put vehicle mitigation bollards in her doorway? No, we're not. But is it reasonable to expect Mrs. Miggins to understand the risk and what suspicious behaviour looks like? That costs nothing. That's all part of that freely available training. So I think that is reasonable. Is it reasonable for Mrs. Miggins to have a trauma first aid kit, which costs 15 quid to put together? Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. Is it reasonable that Mrs. Miggins has a plan? And it's the plans that I think will create the proportionate mitigation for many, many risks. As Andy references, the plan to counter a terrorist attack is very different to the plan to counter a fire or a flood. It requires a bit more thinking. It requires a bit more it requires a lot more understanding of what terrorist threats look like. So evacuation or evacuation is one option. We talk about the government advice to individuals is to run, hide and tell. If you operate a business in which you've got thousands or even hundreds of people all running, hiding and telling, trust me, that's going to be carnage, and I've seen it. And if we get time later, I'll tell you the story. But effectively, you need to start thinking about guide, shelter, and communicate. So how do you help people run, hide, and tell? But plans save lives. Plans help you be prepared for the worst thing that hopefully will never happen to you. But they are not the same as conventional risks.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I'll pick up on those stories a little bit later on, because it does, having listened to you and working with you before, it does give context to some of the complications that the emergency services and some of the plans, and it gives you all a reference to some of the factors that and decision-making process that actually happens in a terrorism incident or terrorism activity. We go to the next slide. This one is on, having listened to Nick before, this one is a little bit of a red herring, as local authority to plan accordingly to the threat of terrorism. Now, this is a red herring because the local authority will have a resilience panel, which basically look at resilience and recovery post-terrorist attacks. And this is where you, as your plans, if you can liaise with your local authority and actually start to integrate with their resilience plans and their planning, that may cover this area. But planning accordingly for a local authority, I'll let Nick talk about this eloquently, and just kind of, do they have plans, Nick? Are they effective? Are they robust? That's a question.
So the issue about local authorities is that the law, the Civil Contingencies Act, says that the local resilience forum must exist, but that's as far as the law goes. It doesn't describe the things that they must plan for. So typically, local authorities will plan for, fire, flood, and famine, the more common risks that they face. They won't necessarily plan for terrorism because they don't see it as a risk to which they are exposed. Now, any town that's been exposed to terrorism will realise very quickly that not having a plan to recover from it is going to be detrimental to the general welfare of your citizens. It's going to be very detrimental to your economy, and potentially it's going to be detrimental to your reputation if you don't manage things properly. So we were just asking for the government to mandate terrorism as a compulsory item in local risk assessments. I don't necessarily think this bit is going to get picked up. It's not necessarily the bit that's going to save lives. The other four pieces will. And this is more likely to be tackled through amendments to the Civil Contingencies Act rather than the new piece of legislation that we're asking for. So in the overall protect duty, it's a bit of a red herring, but still a very important thing to consider.
Thanks, Nick. That's great, and a good bit of advice, I think. The next slide talks about, this is when we're designing this, we'll actually talk about why the protect strategies come around. If you look at terrorist attacks, in my opinion, terrorist attacks are changing. If you look at the 80s and the 90s, those of us who were alive then, and you saw the big attacks in Canary Wharf and some of the bigger, more explosive attacks, what happens with those attacks, particularly with terrorist networks? They need quite a bit of organization and surveillance and authorities and cash and an intelligence network that actually delivers that type of ordnance. Thankfully, due to forensic technology, what can happen is the big explosive attacks have actually changed, and they're much more detectable by forensic technology to actually work out terrorist networks. And so what's happening now, as we've seen in the London Bridge attacks and the Borough Market and the Finsbury Mosque attacks, is it's very difficult to actually start to detect some of the attacks we've seen in recent years, 2017 onwards. This is down to radicalization and, people in their own bedrooms, creating a plan, picking up a kitchen knife, picking up a hire vehicle and driving it into people whilst they're having their lunch in markets and attacking people. Very hard to detect, and it's very hard to actually kind of work and enforce, if you like. So the idea of it is to actually start to disrupt the logistics and the actual planning of it. And talking about logistics, it's very hard for terrorist units to get the logistic components of explosives, if you like, because of the networks have actually changed it quite considerably, that you cannot get components of explosive devices very easily now. So we're starting to see a lot more attacks which are thought of and integrated and made from within bedrooms of radicalized personnel. Nick, again, I'll come back to you on that. I'm sure if you're frozen. I think Nick's frozen. So have you got any questions?
I'm back.
Got you back now. Got you back.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. You're frozen, but I can hear you. It's good.
Yeah, apologies for that. I had a brief power cut, believe it or not. That's what comes when you live in the countryside. The key issue here is in 2014, a man called Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who was a spokesperson for ISIS, made a now very notorious speech in which he said, you know, if you're not able to find an IED or a bullet, then single out the disbelieving American, Frenchman, or any of their allies. And this is the important bit that changed the rhetoric forever. Smash his head with a rock, or slaughter him with a knife, or run him over with your car, or throw him down from a high place, or choke him or poison him. And it was at that moment, Andy, that we moved from what you've described as this sort of organised, networked terrorism to anybody is attempting anything.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks for that, Nick. That just gives you a bit of background onto the why the threats are changing and terrorism is changing, and why we have to be more aware of it. This is a bit of an advisory slide, and basically this stipulate that public accessible location is defined as any place to which the public or any section of the public have access on payment or otherwise, as of right or by virtue of express or implied permission. And I think this is one of the main questions we get, what does it apply to? So at present, it applies to owners and operators of publicly accessible venues with a capacity of 100 persons or more, that it should apply to larger organisations employing 250 staff or more that operate at public accessible locations, and it should be used to improve security considerations and the outcomes at public spaces. Now that obviously brings a lot of maybe some of you attendees today into the frame. So anybody with over 100 accessible implied permissions, railway stations, public concourses, anywhere with a big volume of people footfall will be affected by this protect duty, shopping centres, for example, etc. Nick, have you got anything on that?
Yeah, so I think those thresholds will change slightly. I'm in a slightly difficult position, which is I get in confidence briefings from the Home Office as part of the campaign, so I do know what the thresholds are, but I'm not permitted to say at the moment, I'm afraid, to apologise. But they are going to be slightly greater than that. But as I say, hundreds of thousands of businesses, maybe not the 650, but certainly a very, very, very large number. And the only law is always very reluctant to provide exemptions. And interestingly, I saw something from a sector the other day. It said, "Oh, we're going to be exempt from the protect duty." Very few people are going to be exempt from the protect duty. The only people that I'm aware are going to be exempt from the protect duty are those who have a statutory counter-terrorism responsibility already. So that will be your railways, that will be your aviation, where they are held and managed at most other places, and that's why when you go through an airport, you go through a screening that you go through. But even then, some elements of airports will be subject to a duty, because not every element of an airport is subject to Department for Transport regulations. So I think that the key takeaway from this particular slide, Andy, is that it will affect a lot of people, and almost certainly it will affect everybody with a venue of a capacity of more than 100 people. But you might be the protect duty until you get to another threshold. But as I say, it will still affect a lot of people.
Great, thanks for that, Nick. It's perfect, thank you. Okay, the next slide is the talking about likelihoods of areas where it will be effective, and Nick has kindly given us a kind of a risk matrix factor that we will discuss in detail, I would suggest. So public venues, including retail or entertainment chains, large venues for entertainment and sports, tourist attractions and shopping centres, public spaces such as car parks, beaches, towns, city squares and pedestrian areas. So those of you on this webinar who do village shows and festivals within the town, that will be affected. But again, going to the mitigating factors, which this slide shows, you must show that you've considered and potentially mitigated some of the risks that your risk assessment that may demonstrate prior to your event. Nick, I don't know if you want to go through your risk matrix here.
Well, I colloquially call them the arrows of doom. So basically what that little diagram at the bottom represents is the types of attack that terrorists would aspire to use and the likelihood of their usage. So if we look on the left-hand side, any terrorist would love to get hold of a nuclear weapon. They'd love to get hold of radiological material. But it's because of the the controls and the security around those things, it's highly unlikely that they would be able to get hold of those, and therefore becomes very unlikely that an attack would emanate from that quarter. As you go around the arrows, you then start to move into things that are more likely. So a chemical and biological attack, we've actually seen terrorists attempt biological attacks. Ricin is the most common form of tried, usually not successfully. And of course, I think it was 2000, we had the spate of anthrax letters around the world. But the most common chemical attack generally is used in criminal matters. It's simply throwing acid at people. So those sorts of attacks are starting to become more likely. If we go over to the far side, rather than go around every arrow, because I think it's fairly self-explanatory, the most common type of attack we see in the UK and generally Western Europe is the blunt or bladed weapon attack. Because anybody can go into a shop and buy a knife, anybody can stick it into somebody else. Very difficult to defeat spontaneously, particularly in the public area, and especially in any area that there's been no screening. Vehicle attacks, obviously, we have a fairly significant history of vehicle attacks in the UK. The first one actually wasn't Westminster Bridge, it was the attack on poor Lee Rigby, who was run down first before then attacked by knives. But since then we saw obviously the Westminster Bridge vehicle attack, the London Bridge and the Finsbury Mosque vehicle attack. So again, anybody can get a hold of a car. At its most devastating, would be the Nice attack, which was a 7.5-ton lorry into a very crowded public place. I think it killed 83 or 86, something like that. Terrible. Arson, again, very easy. Petrol bombs. Terrorists do use arson, not as common as others, because quite often fire does damage to property, doesn't really kill people. The fire safety systems. Improvised explosive device, IEDs, we've seen quite a few of those used in the UK. One of the reasons that we moved from that mass scale terrorism of destroying city blocks to the type of terrorism we see these days is because we stopped the ability of people being able to buy precursor chemicals. So the Irish Republican terrorists used to make their bombs using fertilizer. Well, the sale of fertilizer is now regulated and is tracked, so it becomes less easy for people to use. The bombs we've seen in the UK in the last year have been hydrogen peroxide based. So basically your hair dye, go and buy it in small batches in lots of different places so you don't get trapped, and then distill it down and add other chemicals, and you have a very, very volatile explosive. Firearms is an interesting one. Clearly we see firearms terrorism in other countries where firearms are more readily accessible. What we haven't really seen in the UK is a significant criminal to terrorist crossover. And so I'd suggest your greatest risk from firearms is from the criminal use of firearms. It's a hard one to judge as to why those, but there are sufficient unlawfully held firearms in the UK for it to become a real possibility that one of those finds its way into the wrong hands.
Grand, thanks, Nick. And I think the overriding, one of the objectives of terrorism is to create fear amongst the population. And that's one of their main tools, is to create a fear. Basic vehicle-based attacks, blunt or bladed weapons attacks, create fear amongst the community and stop them doing conventional things that communities do. And we've seen that in different areas. So that's one of the objectives. Conventionally, terrorism cannot take on a modern security forces or modern military. So therefore, they go back to a bit more of something that's very detectable. And we do go back to the radicalization, and which is one of the main thrusts of the contest strategy produced by the government, which is another subject. So security enhancements, really, and this is an area I'm interested in, is situational awareness. And, you know, if you do have security personnel, their situational awareness and the disruption factors, so behavior techniques, looking for patterns of behavior that may be what we term hostile. If any of you know about the terrorist attack cycle, the first two phases is where they did target selection and put surveillance onto a potential target. That is the area where they're most vulnerable. And again, if you have security personnel working with you, it's one of the areas that you can look into about disruption of the hostile surveillance, if you like, that is taken before a target is selected. Support and training. This has come out, and I've put a lovely little picture of a teddy bear here with wounds on it. One of the things that came out from the Manchester Arena attack was the and something that certainly should be on your radar is the trauma medicine and bleed control. You know, first responders and first aid at work. And this will be changing coming up with part of the protect duty, because it was found significantly that bleed control and tourniquet use was non-existent in Manchester, and actually it's starting to become in now into first aid at work and first responders, so that people, and it should be on your radar, that they have bleed control packs and trauma medicine modules are added to your first aid at work. And this is something I think should be on your radar going forward, and you'll see companies coming out with different modules to add into your first aid at work policies, procedures, and indeed your equipment. Nick, I don't know if you have anything on that.
Yeah, so I work as a consultant, so I would never want to put consultants out of work. But so much of what we talk about is really common sense. And the thing about bleed control, or no, the thing that came out of Manchester was this idea that there's a care gap, and it's, you know, from the point of an incident occurring to the point at which professional medical services arrive. And any organisation needs to have a realistic plan for dealing with that care gap. And I don't know where people are in the country, but certainly, you know, in some places that can be a long wait, notwithstanding, you know, some of the hiccups that occurred at Manchester. In any other place, you know, I waited 2 hours for ambulances in London before now. So you need to have the right kit. The thing about trauma kits is that they are not complicated. You know, they are a tourniquet, a chemical you can put onto blood to make it congeal, or they are trauma pads. And one of the things that we did fairly recently is we simplified first aid. And there's an organisation called Citizen Aid, and you'll find them at citizenaid.org. And they are the great advocates of you know, anybody can do first aid. And while it's great that people go and do courses, and I always encourage them to do so, when somebody's bleeding in front of you, it doesn't really matter whether you've done first aid or not. You need to try and stop the bleeding. And that's what Citizen Aid are brilliant at providing advice around. You don't need to spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on a trauma kit. If you Google publicly accessible trauma kit, you will find a specification defined by Citizen Aid, St John's and the police. And I recently took 150 of those kits out to Ukraine because I thought they'd be quite useful for people caught up in bombings there. And each kit cost me about 15 quid to put together by buying materials from Amazon rather, sorry.
Great, that's good advice, Nick. Thanks for that and quality. All right, let's move on. This is some of the other things you should be considering whilst you're looking at the protect duty, and this is internal for your staff. And the first thing is guidance. We spoke about in evacuations and e-evacuations, how complicated the picture can be. So actually guidance to your staff on what to do on a rogue terrorist or an active shooter campaign or whatever is some of the guidance to your staff and what they do in situations and on hostile threats, if you like. So guidance is key. That's your policy and procedures. The next area we look at is shelter. So in evacuation is safe areas to go where your staff congregate, which is safe. You know, thinking about that, they may not be there. It's not going to be a short period of time that they're there. So again, think about, you know, medical packs if you've got them there. Think about water, rations, and think about a safe area where you have a good form of communication, landline communication, rather than mobile phones, so that you can actually contact people. And the shelter should be lockable and specific enough to stop any ordnance coming through it. So make sure it's not in plastered walls, if you like, and just partitioning. Make sure it's actually a supported wall and an area where your colleagues can go. Communication was also one of the main factors to consider about the actual kind of confusion that goes on in an incident. So communicating with your staff, and there's many systems out online that you can do mass distributions. I've heard of companies having WhatsApp group sort of effective communication, but please bear in mind that sometimes the airways are blocked, so therefore communication is very difficult. So landline is quite specific on that. But this is something to consider in evacuation, safe areas to go within your premises, and resources. You might want some energy bars and some water, etc., as well as medical. So we would turn them emergency grab bags. And again, goes back to your training, your procedures, your practice, and thirdly and lastly is communication. We can give you more details on this if you wanted and post this and give you more details on the advice and guidance on this as we go on. But this is one of the considerations you should have as you're preparing for the protect strategy. Nick.
Yeah, thanks. So at the end of 2017, something you might remember, in December, there was a mass hysteria event on Oxford Street, and it started with two guys fighting on a tube platform, and somehow that got miscommunicated into a terrorist incident, and we had hundreds and thousands of people running scared down Oxford Street. And I've seen the footage from various big companies down there, you know, Debenhams as was, and Selfridges and people like that. And there are literally waves of hundreds and hundreds of people storming in and out of those premises. And what happened was, you know, there was no terrorist event, but people suffered life-changing injuries because there was no control over what was going on. 60-second security check. Now, the 60-second security check is exactly that, and it's something you can do today. Again, if you Google 60-second security check, you'll find it. But basically, what you need is somebody to be in charge. Who's going to make the decisions about what to do in those crises? How do you get in and out of the building in an emergency? How do you lock down quickly? Where can you hide? And as Andy's quite rightly described, you know, you need to be thinking that one through before an event. How do you communicate? And importantly, how do you stay updated? How do you help people run, hide and tell? From your staff, because one person on their own can't do these things. So the 60-second security check is a cracking little way of just dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. And where we saw it go badly wrong was where nobody did take charge. and nobody did lock the doors or nobody did open them, depending on what the right decision was going to be. I mean, it really was horrific, and the most horrific thing I saw was in one of those premises, the escalators go up the middle of the building, and there's a great big atrium runs down 4 or 5 floors. And for some reason, about a floor and a half up, a guy was on the escalator, and he was so afeared of what was going on around him, he just jumped off the escalator. There was nothing, chaos, and he jumped off the escalator and he fell all the way floor and a half down and then into the basement, so 2.5 floors. Broke both his legs in 3 places, absolutely life-changing injuries. And that was really, to be honest, because nobody was controlling the situation and nobody was communicating what was really going on.
Thanks, Nick. Before we come on to questions and answers, Nick, I think there was that's one of your little stories we came out with there. I wonder if you could explain to us, as we worked before, you were discussing some of the complicated pictures the security services have in response to an attack. I wonder if that was a story you were going to convey, but I think it's very valid.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to share that. So, but I only ever tell stories that have got a lesson attached to them, and because otherwise they're just boring stories. So one of the things I think everybody needs to be aware of is that in the early stages of any incident, whether it's terrorism, fire, flood, or famine, there's likely to be going on, and there's likely to be a very, very high reliance on the people who are first there, which is probably going to be you, and if you've got security teams, your security teams, to actually start making that situation better. And if I give you the example was that 22nd of March 2017, the Westminster Bridge attack. The actual situation was a person in an SUV drove down the pavement, ran over lots of people, but killed 4 and knocked 1 into the river, then crashed into the gate and stabbed to death a police officer in Parliament. That came into policing as a bus going off Westminster Bridge into the River Thames. It came as a bomb had gone off on Westminster Bridge. It came as 4 people with firearms marauding through the West End. And I think, in our debriefs, we were honest with ourselves that it took us a number of hours to really understand what we were dealing with and to match that with the right resources. So this idea of what saved lives and what controlled the situation until the might of London's emergency services could be brought to bear were individuals doing the right thing. Individuals who perhaps had some training, individuals who acted intuitively in some cases to save lives. So this idea of having plans, this idea of having the 60-second security check of who's in charge, who's actually going to help make, I can just promise you, if you ever have to do it, you will think that's the most precious 60 seconds you've ever spent in your lives, thinking it through and being prepared for the unexpected.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think that's a really valuable insight into some of the complications and decision making. And I've just literally written down, it's the individuals at the time, at the scene, making fast decisions that can only be prepared for. And I think running through the whole Protect strategy is actually preparation and planning, and actually organizing your coordination, your standard operating procedures. So if you have to make a decision, those decisions are made easier because you've planned and you've practiced and you've actually gone through decision-making process. And again, those of you in security, is going to be one of your prime objectives, is to make decisions based on those observations and those incident management. So I think as we come through now, we're just going to go on to any questions and answers. As I said before, we can't see you and I can't see any questions, so I'm going to invite IRSM organizer to come back in to see if we've had any questions come through. And obviously, Nick, it's always a pleasure to work with you on this. I mean, in my experience, you're the actual go-to knowledge point for the Protect strategy. So thanks ever so much for your guidance and working with me on this. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much,
very
both
kind.
of you. Fascinating and really interesting session, and clearly our attendees agree, as we have quite a few questions. We'll get through as many as we can in the time we have left, but if there are any left over, I hope you don't mind if I drop you a quick note afterwards so that we can get answers and I can get back to those people. But let's get through what we can. So the first question we have is, how can you profile a terrorist once in the public places? So once they're in.
Well, Nick, that's actually my part of my actual dissertation for my master's degree was on security personnel, or can personnel detect hostile behaviour without the use of technology? A simple question to that is I think if you ask anybody in a room, and this is typically what we do, is how many of you have looked at something before and things haven't felt quite right, or some behaviour hasn't felt quite right? Most people would put their hands in the air. So there is an unnatural act on a hostile reconnaissance to even put your mind into that framework. Because if you were traveling from A to B into a location to actually do a reconnaissance on it, and the security is very strong and the security is very switched on, and therefore your chance of being detected and maybe stopped by uniformed police services or approached by security personnel puts you under a pressure. So my studies looked at what we call a parasympathetic and sympathetic responses, which is people under pressure and how their body language reacts. And it's a training method that you can look at. But again, my first piece of advice for any security personnel on this course was go with your gut instinct. And I'm sure Nick will back me up on this, is that most terrorist incidents, there has been something's been seen before it actually took place, and there's always been some kind of, but it's never been acted on. And I think, you know, being from the security world in our industry, I think that now is the time to actually start enhancing security personnel so that they can detect hostile behaviours. Nick, I'm not, my master's degree is on behavioural detection, but I'll ask your experience as well.
No, it totally is. And in fact, detection is one of the mainstays of our national security strategy at the moment. What Andy says is 100% right, is we are genetically wired to recognise threats, and I would always advocate, if the hairs on the back of your neck are standing on end, you are seeing something that isn't right. But you can be more scientific about it, and there's lots of people out there doing lots of different training courses for behavioural detection. My message to you is, if in any doubt whatsoever, report it. Report it. However silly you think it might be, report it. Last year, counter-terrorism police were given 10,000 pieces of information, of which 2,000 were became actionable intelligence. That's not a bad ratio, I can tell you, from an intelligence perspective. But arguably, it says, well, 8,000 pieces of information, were no good whatsoever. I tell you what, counter-terrorism policing were not unhappy at all to receive those 8,000. So, if in doubt, report.
And I can give you another example. For example, in the Istanbul bombing of the airport, in the departures lounge of the airport, the security personnel did pick up the perpetrator, and their actual radio messages went, watch him. He was carrying a long coat, which he had this underneath the coat was a Kalashnikov's and some other ordnance. And the actual security did pick him up by saying, watch him, he's a shoplifter. And that was the actual communication. This is after that airport was identified as a hostile target. So again, it's about just disclosing and handing it over, and nothing wrong with handing information over to the police to support you on any conventional security operations. Sorry, a long answer question, but I thought it was worth going into it that way.
Definitely, thank you. Rather than for those who manage such places, what guidance would you have for those with employees who go to work in publicly accessible places, such as places of worship, but also private properties where one might encounter radicalised members of the public?
That's a cracking question. Whoever asked that, brilliant, well done. So the Act Awareness e-learning package, which is free, it's an online resource, takes about 45 minutes to complete, will show your employees what terrorism is, what it looks like, and the sorts of things that they ought to be thinking about and recognising. That is a really great resource. And anybody with employees who are public facing really ought to be doing that. There are other resources available for recognising radicalisation. One is called Act Early, and that helps parents and those people who are responsible for safeguarding recognise the sorts of behaviours and materials that you might come across if the person you're responsible for is potentially being radicalised. But again, I'll just go back to this bit about if you don't feel right, it probably isn't. And if you were in somebody's house and you saw what you thought might be an Islamic State flag or a right-wing symbol, just investigate whether it needs to be worried about or not.
Sure, and I probably extend that as well, Nick, and studying from the American market as well, and drifting away from actual bona fide terrorist outfits. Some of these attacks made from disgruntled employees, etc. And then if you look at mental health and well-being in the workplace, that's an area also to be aware of as people's behaviour changes in the workplace. So again, it's drifting away from terrorism per se, and it goes into maybe mental health, anger, hostility towards employees, friends, etc. So again, in any workplace, it's about looking at behaviours and actually, again, communication, having a good thread of communication within an organisation.
Thank you. How do we ensure that this doesn't become a tick box exercise for venues and operators? Are there plans or aspirations for proactive monitoring bodies along the lines of the HSE or likewise?
Yeah.
So again, another really fabulous question. I think one of the things that I would be at liberty to disclose is that the enforcement of the law is the bit that's causing most problems to define, but three options. So one option is a completely new regulatory body. The second option is to tag regulation onto an existing regulatory body. And the third option was to have a, I'd describe it, I guess, as a passive regulator, which is it's only dealt with by default. But agencies like the police and other people, bodies are encouraged to maintain a view of what's right and what's wrong. As of 4 weeks ago, those options were still being explored. I think there are some real challenges. So a whole new regulatory body is going to cost money. And this is a government that's had to deal with an awful lot of economic woe. Tagging it onto another regulator, safety and security are not the same things. So it's hard to it'd be hard to merge those two things together. The one thing that the government were adamant about was that wherever this goes, the body must have assurance experience and counter-terrorism experience. That doesn't give too many options for existing structures. So, we can maybe draw some conclusions around where it might end up, but say long answer to a short question is that there isn't a defined answer at the moment. I think it's really important to know that the one thing that is really well defined is what the level of penalties will be. And they will reflect, the sorts of penalties that you can see in the Health and Safety Act, which can range from enforcement notices through to imprisonment, and some very big fines in between.
That's great.
Brilliant, thank you. There are a couple more. I think we can maybe squeeze in one more, and then I'll I'll ping a note through of the last question, if that's okay. Will the Protect Act advise a change in the standard workplace first aid kit contents?
I mean, yeah, Nick, from my perspective, and I'm going to go back to your previous advice, you know, I would suggest that, and this is just my opinion, is that bleed control, Celox, you know, trauma bandages will be part of a first aid box, and tourniquet and things like that. But again, going back to Nick's earlier, it's about control of traumatic bleeding and things like that. So there is a potential for, in my opinion, just an opinion, an added module of training and also added equipment in first aid at work. But that's my opinion, and I'm going to refer to Nick for his guidance and expertise on this.
No, well, again, because I don't think so. It's not going to be prescribed in the Protect Duty, because that's not what the Protect Duty is about. Could it end up being an amendment to health and safety regulations? Well, I don't see why not. But is that going to happen as an early change? I suspect not. I think the interesting thing about the Protect Duty, though, and it's worth people reflecting on, is you can't unknow what you know. And if you followed the Manchester Arena inquiry, you'll know that people bled to death. And therefore, from a public liability perspective, if you're not prepared to deal with those sorts of situations, you probably hold a very significant civil liability anyway. So I can't answer the question precisely, but perhaps give you a steer there as to where I think it might go.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Right, we will wrap that up there. Thank you so much to both of you. That was really, really, really interesting. Thank you to everyone who has joined us and contributed with your questions. The recording will be on the YouTube channel either later today or tomorrow, so you'll be able to catch up on anything that you've missed or want to recap in your own time. And that's all. So I'm going to end the session there and hope to see you again.
I'd like to add is we'll send out this presentation to anybody. Anybody's got any questions, please come back and we can answer any questions you may further have in line with this. So that's our support for IRSM. So perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye.